Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the future. You'll recognise this later on when you take your cover of the when you take your books, because it's the cover of the book that the Entrepreneurs Forum have provided, and it's one of our very recent books, where we really try to look to see what we think is starting to happen as we move into the future. And start to think about how some of these factors affect the way that we live our lives, the way that we run our businesses, the way that they impact society. And technology plays a big part of that. So I'm going to look and provide some examples of what technology is doing and some observations about how that may change the way we do business in the future. But what's really important to me is to always have at the heart of when we think about how things are changing, that actually what we face isn't a technological challenge, it's actually a societal challenge, and it's particularly a challenge about our mindsets, about our leadership, and how we develop people to try to make sense of the changes that we're starting to see. And one of the things that I think goes to the real heart of this is the way that we think about the future of our businesses, the way that we plan the future of our businesses, and the kind of issues that we consider as we go through that journey. So my perspective is that future-based organizations operate across these three timeframes in parallel. So we have to be really good at delivering the operational and tactical stuff now. We have to be really good in the current year. And of course, there's a really interesting thing that happens here within businesses generally, and that's about how we're incentivized and how we incentivize our people. Because we tend to be incentivized, and we incentivize based on what we do in the current 12 months. Rarely do we say, let's see how good we're going to be into the future, into the next 3, 4, 5 years, and then we'll decide how you're going to be incentivized. So there's an interesting challenge there if we want to prepare our organizations for the future in the way that we're incentivizing our people. The next thing we tend to do is once a year, we try to take a step out of the day-to-day tactical stuff, and we try to think, so whereabouts is our growth coming from? What are the things that we're seeing in the outside world that we think will change the way our business looks over the next 2, 3, 4 years? And what we do when we do that, we typically strike a single point forecast at some point in the future to give ourselves a bit of comfort, so that we're comfortable and that we're relaxed and that we can give people some good news that are investing in our business, that we are going to achieve that particular target to 3 decimal places. The reality, though, I think is very different. And this is where very successful organizations have a different perspective about the future as well. So they do those first 2 steps, but they also look much further into the future, maybe out 10 years. And they're trying to see, what are the weak signals that we're seeing? What are the things that we're starting to notice about new business models, about new technologies, about new social trends, to try to get a sense of how the future may play out. And I don't think this is about identifying one future outcome. It's about looking at the things that we can learn about the potential future from the signals, and maybe identifying a number of different plausible futures. Because actually what that then allows us to do is to develop flexible and resilient strategies in our business now, so that when we come to a turn point as our businesses develop, we can change direction of the business very easily. And I think some of these ideas are why I would suggest that we need some new ideas around leadership, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So one of the things that I think that we need to be completely conscious of as we move forward is a whole range of different macro drivers. So we see a lot of things that are starting to happen in the world today. We've spoken already a little bit about the pace and change around technology, but there are also differences about urban infrastructure, about societal changes, about the way politics is changing. So I wouldn't want us to think that it's just about technology. I think the other thing that I observe when I look at a list like this is the interconnectivity between these different drivers. So it's not just one thing that's changing. It's not just a dozen things that are changing. It's also the interrelationship between these things. And what I want to do now is just pick up 1 or 2 of my favorites here, just to give you a sense of the relative importance and how I think these things are changing. So what I think we are seeing is increasing disruption in most of our marketplaces, in the world at large. And we've got 2 really good examples from the political spectrum right now, which is Brexit and Trump. And if we go back 5 years, who would have seen the impact of those political decisions made through democratic process and the implications they have for the way we live our lives, the way we run our businesses? So this idea that things are changing really rapidly, they're being very disruptive, causes us pain, causes us some discomfort. It creates complexity for us. But I think our reality is that this is the way the world is going to evolve over the next few years. So it's one of the things that we need to pay attention to. I think this loss of control, this kind of essence that everything is becoming increasingly uncertain, challenges us as well. One of the things I think most of us like to do within our businesses is identify a whole bunch of things, create some comfort and confidence around our assessment of them so that we have more certainty. But maybe what we need to do is embrace that uncertainty and create a sense within our organizations that uncertainty is a fact of life. We just need to get better at dealing with it rather than trying to resist it. And again, this issue of uncertainty starts to have implications across a whole range of different domains. And it's driven by a whole number of those different drivers and factors that are actually coming into play around the future of work, around the way that threats are potentially changing our perspective on geopolitics around the world. So there are lots of issues that we need to think about that are driving uncertainty. For a long time now, sustainability has been an increasingly important aspect of what we do and what we're expected to do as a business. And I really love this framework from the United Nations. So the United Nations have these 17 sustainability goals. And in the past, when we thought about sustainability, we've probably thought about climate change. We thought about the impact that we have on our natural environment. What I like about this is it goes much broader than that. It says in order for us to be sustainable as a species on the planet, we need to not only think about our impact on the natural environment, but we also need to think about creating sustainable businesses. What does sustainable economics mean? How do we eradicate poverty? How do we eradicate hunger? How do we generate much more gender equality around the world so that we can start to develop what we think of in Fast Future as a very human future? One that sees humanity surviving and thriving, and not one that necessarily sees the tech companies behind the driving forces that control, direct, and manage our lives and our businesses. So I think this framework becomes increasingly important. I think up till now, sustainability has kind of been a nice to do. It's great for PR. I think increasingly in the future, it will be a license to operate. And we're starting to see that now with research that's happening about younger generations. Younger generations feel much more of an affinity against brands that pay attention to some of these values. So I think it is going to become increasingly important as a license to do business. I also see this notion about two worlds colliding. And maybe this is where we come into a transition between an analog and a very much more digitized world. So in an analog world, people probably around my age have got an understanding that technology could be a solution to the problem that I have in mind. But I'm used to a certain notion of ownership. I'm used to producing things, producing services in an appropriate way, owning a house, owning a car. So assets have a particular framing in my mind about how useful they are and how valuable they are to me. But I think that world is coming into collision with a new world, a digitized world. And people in a digitized world don't think the same way. The value that they see is in data and information. And we see that in some of the newer businesses now. Newer businesses that we're seeing starting to emerge aren't hotel companies, they're not car hire companies, they're data companies. And it's the data that gives them the real value of the services and the products they provide. People who are digitized have grown up with social media. They understand devices, they understand computers, they know how to use them. They work, they communicate, they shop, they spend their leisure time in a very different way to people in an analog world. And I think this is where our future marketplaces are. Our future marketplaces are digitized, and I think our businesses need to be digitized in the future as well. And what's at the heart of this is this absolute explosion of science and technology developments. And now, people will often say to me that, well, we've been through what we call an industrial revolution in the past. People at the moment are using the phrase the fourth industrial revolution to describe where we are now. But I think what's very different about this is just the plethora of different technologies that we're starting to see emerge. Be it artificial intelligence, 3D and 4D printing, quantum computing, nanotechnology. There are just so many of these different technologies, some of them that I think feel a little bit like science and magic blurring. So if we start to think about human augmentation and notions that transhumanists project, which is how we might be eventually merging with machines, almost to create a new subspecies. So there are lots of really wild and wacky ideas, except these are in the science possible and probable list. They're not in a science fiction world. They're not in a fantasy world. Everything that's on this chart is at some point, at some place around the world, in a lab being worked on right now, including wireless brain-computer interface. So there are just so many technologies that are coming together at the same time with the capability to change so much of what we do that I think we need to be prepared for a very different world in the future. I'm just going to kind of whiz through a few of the technologies that fascinate me. I'm sure we're all aware of the potential of artificial intelligence. What I think was really interesting was around about 2 years ago, AI started appearing in the lay media. I was on the BBC talking about it and its impact potentially on jobs. And I think once we see something that's very scientific, that's very technological driven, that's very new, come into the public domain, then something happens with that. So it comes into the consciousness and it starts to create very often a fear factor. We need to be clear about that fear factor, and the fear factor around AI is very much about automation and about how that automation may take jobs out of the marketplace. And if we look at the kind of domains that we see AI operating in right now, we can see how that could be the case. So I guess that gives us a choice as a society. Do we sit and let that happen, or do we look at creating new ways of working, new businesses that actually say, here's a whole bunch of things that we're used to having people doing, we're going to let the machines do that, and we're going to focus our people on doing other things, maybe the real things that it's harder for artificial intelligence to do now. Because unless we do that, then we begin to really question what we're going to do with people. And the impacts of that, not just on our businesses, but on society more broadly, you know, that's really tough stuff to take about what could happen if we roll that through. This is one of my favorite examples. Gillian laughed at this earlier on, so hopefully more than one person will now as well. So the Internet of Things is all about a number of different devices, and some estimates suggest that by 2025 there might be 100 billion devices connected to the Internet. Don't get me started on the energy need for all these, by the way, that's a whole different story. So 100 billion devices, maybe 1 trillion sensors, but this could have an impact of about $19 trillion on the economy. Here's one example. So this is a mattress manufacturer, and it's putting sensors into a mattress so that it can monitor how you sleep. So if you have a bad night's sleep, it will provide data about that sleep, about the way you were laying, what your movements were during the night, and maybe you can then come up with some ideas about sleeping slightly differently so you get a better night's sleep. But it's not being promoted for that, because you can connect those sensors to an app on your mobile phone. And it will then send you a signal, if you may be at work in the office, when your mattress is being used. It's funny how that laugh kind of goes around the room. Oh, wrong way. Let's talk amongst yourselves whilst I talk about the technology but show I can't use it. Okay. So I spoke really briefly a little while ago about 3D printing. This is fascinating for me. So here's one example how 3D printing could potentially change one industry, or is it more than one industry? Local Motors is a US-based car company that 3D print cars. Now the car on the left-hand side, you can decide whether it's desirable or not, but it's their first model. And it's made from 50 components. Most cars, average cars, are probably made from around about 5,000 components. So already that you can see there's a bit of a difference there about when you put these things together. But then when you get underneath that, you can turn round a profit by exceeding 2,500 production units of a local motor strati of a 3D printed car. If you produce a car in a conventional factory, you need somewhere between 75 and 100,000 units. So already you see, okay, so I don't need an enormous big factory sat somewhere and ship those cars all around the world. I can actually produce these cars locally. So you begin to challenge the logistics around the car industry then. Do we need to ship these things all over the world? But don't forget, this car actually only needs 50 components and I print those on site. So it completely wipes out the component supply chain. So a 3D printed car doesn't just change the car industry, it changes a mass of other industry sectors behind it. Now what Local Motors have done, they said, you know, that's great, we can 3D print electric manually driven cars and we can 3D print AI-driven autonomous minibuses. So you begin to see how combination of technology, of AI, of robotics in essence in the bus, together with 3D printing, creates a very different vehicle, creates a very different industry, and has an impact on some very traditional industries that we see. I want to just spend a little bit of time as well thinking about smart cities. Smart cities, I'm sure we've all heard of them. What do we mean by those? I think what we mean, and it depends who you ask, we mean a very connected, a technologically driven city, connected so that IT is prevalent everywhere, so that we can continue to work wherever we are. But I think a smart city is also a city that's built with a human in mind and not with a particular technology in mind. So how do we use technology to help us behave in the way that we want to behave, to work in the way that we want to work, to do the leisure things that we want to do in the way that we want to do them, to move around the city, maybe with autonomous vehicles in the way that we want to do in the future. And there's an estimate, one estimate of $41 trillion going into smart city infrastructure over the next few years. Now, obviously, some cities are maybe easier to make smart than others. But it's quite interesting that almost every major city around the world is looking at integrated technology to help the city move, to help people do things in their cities, whatever that might mean. I just want to go back to artificial intelligence, because we hear a lot at the moment about artificial intelligence, how that can be combined with robotics, and how that can automate lots of different tasks that we might undertake in our workplaces. But if we then think about some of the other technologies we're seeing, holographic projection technologies, virtual augmented reality, then maybe what we see is the potential for our workplaces being populated not just by normal humans. A quick scan around the room suggests to me that most of us are normal humans, but also maybe the humans that the transhumanists see. So humans that have been enhanced through other technologies. Then also through artificially intelligent robots, also through interacting with avatars and holograms. So maybe our workplaces then become really, really different in the future. What if I really fancy that job that's in that other department and the thing that I'm up against isn't another human like me, it's an artificially intelligent robot who won't demand the fringe benefits, who won't want holiday, who can work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and knows more than I do anyway. So some of these technologies lead us to a place which creates a really different sense of what workplace could look like in the future. Now, I'm conscious that's a really kind of quick skip through some of the things that resonate strongly with me about how the future will change. I don't want to create the sense that this is kind of like a futuristic Armageddon, because I think within that we have some really interesting choices about what we do, and we'll get onto those in the second part of this. But what I think it would be really good to do is on your tables, there's a couple of flip charts if you wanted to use flip charts, but otherwise just use any note paper that you have, is think about these two questions. So if you write down one or two future factors that could have a bearing on your business, and then think about one or two ways those factors could play out. So if you spend a couple of minutes doing that maybe on your own, and then have a conversation around the table about those factors that you've identified and some of the ways that you think they might play out and impact your business. So I'm thinking here of things that happen outside of your business. So not the things that you have control or choice over, but some of these external factors that we're starting to see. Is it okay? Seems some slightly puzzled faces around the room. Go with it. What did we say we'd have with this? Should we say about 10 or 15 minutes thinking about this and a quick conversation? And then we'll go around the room just to see what you've been talking about. I think one of the interesting things is that we possibly into the future, and maybe we're talking 10, 15, 20 years out now, but our notion of what automated systems can do in terms of sense making, in terms of exhibiting intelligence, exhibiting care and empathy, is kind of the next stage of AI. So AI at the moment is predominantly narrow AI. And by that, I mean there's a particular task, there's a particular data set that AI is looking at to perform a kind of a predetermined task. All right, it's kind of sophisticated algorithms and calculations that actually work that through. But at the moment, you can't take something like AlphaGo Zero, which is really good at playing the game Go, and ask it to diagnose cancer. And you can't take IBM's Watson, that can currently diagnose cancer, and get it to play Go. So at the point that we're able to create artificial intelligence that can multitask or can do different tasks, then maybe we start to access the power of artificial intelligence to do some of these really human traits. But I think the essence of where we are with automation at the moment is that even though it's coming into, if you like, the white collar sector, and we've seen it kind of for a number of years, very prevalent in the blue collar sector, that maybe what we're beginning to feel is a journey almost towards what we call artificial general intelligence or even super intelligence, when machines do exhibit greater degree and broader sense of intelligence than we see in humans at the moment. There's some fresh coffee at the back. Does anyone want to keep the room away from their coffee by saying anything else right now? So what I wanted to do now was just start to think about how some of the changes are starting to affect the opportunities that we have and maybe the challenges also that we have in evolving our businesses as we go forward. And I want to use the example of what choices technology can give us just by picking up this simple example in the retail sector. So if we think about what retail sector experiences might offer us as a shopper, I guess we have three broad categories there. One is we just engage with the retailer through our mobile devices. So it's a purely kind of internet-based experience. We don't actually need to go to the store. We see what we like online, we order it, and it gets delivered to us. Interestingly, we're starting to see some retail experiments around the use of robotics in stores. Be they guides around the stores. We've got robots that guide people around airports now in some places, in some parts of the world. So it's kind of automating the experience in store. But then we're also seeing maybe the higher end, the premium end of the marketplace, really starting to focus on, so what is the human experience that we can add when the customer comes into the store? Now, that's not to say that we can't get a similar high quality experience by using something like augmented reality or virtual reality to make sure the clothes that we might want fit us, to make sure they look okay. But actually, maybe there's a premium end of the market where human contact and human service is always the thing that we want. So I think what this example says is that we need to think about what is it that we're about? What is the place in the market that we want to adopt? Do we want to do everything as efficiently as possible? Do we want to go to the worry of putting what we have to sell in a physical store, or do we want to do it all exclusively online? And I think this actually is the debate that's at the heart of the retail failures that we're starting to see and that we have been seeing recently. And it actually then starts to challenge how we develop and deliver tax receipts to the exchequer from businesses when they're not occupying buildings, where they're not occupying physical spaces in the same way that we've seen in the past. They're not employing people in the same way that we've done in the past. And one of the things I think that this starts to challenge is the whole of the tax system. So some of these technology advances really begin to have a very strong impact on society, on how we might change society from where we shop as consumers, but also from what the government does in terms of developing tax policy to make sure that we can continue to support public services. So that's one kind of small example, the way that technology can change the choices available to us and how some of those choices could actually move through the whole of the system. And thinking about the choices, we do have lots of options available to us. And there are some great examples of when organizations make good choices. And there are some really good examples, probably the better examples in terms of making the point, of organizations that make bad choices. So I'm going to start with Kodak, who made two interesting choices. The first was to ignore Fujifilm. Kodak were really wedded to the idea that American consumers would never desert a good old American company for a cheaper imported product. Okay, they were wrong about that. Then they invented a digital camera. And they said, blimey, we don't like the look of this digital camera. That has the power to completely disrupt our film business. So we won't do anything with that. If only they had foresight. Blockbuster's another interesting one. Blockbuster, obviously the kind of the physical film, video and DVD business. In the very early days of Netflix were obviously really interested in using the internet as a platform for their business. Netflix went to Blockbuster and said, how do you fancy a partnership? Why don't you promote what we offer in your physical stores and we'll promote what you offer online? Blockbuster at the time were much bigger than Netflix and said, no, go away. Blockbuster don't exist. Last time I looked, Netflix were worth $60 billion. So foresight is incredibly important. I'm probably going to say that once or twice. Uber and Airbnb are the often used examples of how we can deploy technology. I think what's really interesting about these is their start point, a bit like Apple, wasn't actually about the technology. It was actually about understanding what the consumer wanted. So if I want to hail a taxi ride, what is it I'm really interested in? I'm interested in identifying where the car is. I want to know that when the car gets to me, that it's going to be in a certain place at a certain time. I want some certainty about how I pay, and I want to be able to use some kind of account methodology in order to pay that. Now, what Uber did, and Airbnb in their business as well, is they used existing technologies in order to deliver those services to the customer and the consumer and built their business model around it. So start with the customer and the consumer in mind. Look to see what the technological solutions are to deliver that value and then build a business model around it. And I think that's really interesting in the way that they've done that. And I think maybe there are some lessons there for all of us to not lose sight of who our customers and consumers are. And if we think about the nature of change that we've seen, then we need to be doubly sure that we're clear which part of the market we're accessing and what some of the drivers for the consumers might be. The other thing that I want to say about these is having engaged with pretty conventional technology to drive their businesses as they have, they're both now looking at new technologies to do something much further. So Airbnb, not only getting into I was going to say storage for people, I don't mean that, but kind of hotels and accommodation, are now looking at physical storage for goods, or using a similar model. Uber are starting to look at new technology around autonomous drone taxis. And autonomous taxis on the road. I forgot about those because that's really quite close. So these companies, not only do they find an innovative way to bring new value to market, new value to consumers very quickly using existing technology, they now are looking at how some of these new technologies can grow and change their business into the future. And I think your point about are we going to have to get used to radical disruption in our marketplaces is absolutely right. I doubt there's a sector at the moment that isn't being disrupted by some new player coming into the market and doing something that's radically different. And a lot of what I see across a number of different sectors is people that already exist in the sector complaining that the new people who have found a new way to deliver value to clients are not subject to the same regulations. Okay, that's because they may be more innovative than the businesses that we're currently working in. So I don't think just necessarily resting back on the regulations, maybe ethical or moral situation, is a reason to just, to think that these are not good, interesting businesses to look at, because they're doing something right and they're doing something that appeals to a broad range of consumers and investors together. And as I say, I'm not disagreeing with what you say. I'm just putting that out there, that these are successful organizations and they're disruptive. So those first few things that I've spoken about there, they really set up this for me. And that's about our mindset challenge. And what is it? Because our mindset really sets how we view the world, how we view what we want to do with our businesses. And for me, there are two choices here. So we can play by the rules of the game that we're used to playing with. But the thing is, I think if you do that, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. But if we think about the pace of change that we're seeing, the radical disruption that we're seeing across all markets, I think standing still is tantamount to going backwards. So how do we play by the rules of a new game? How do we create a new game? How do we become a more ethically or morally responsible Airbnb or Uber? Because maybe that's where the opportunities are. But the big challenge there is, how do we rid ourselves of whatever collateral we have hanging around us that's given us our success to date? Because we need to find a new way of changing our organizational DNA so that we can really embrace disruption, so that we can be creative and innovative in a different way. Because if we don't do that, then we tend to move back into what we're comfortable with, what we've seen has been successful in the past. And maybe that's not the way for us to be successful in the future. So I think mindset is critically important. The other thing that strikes me about everything that we've been talking about so far is this area of the changing nature of the jobs landscape in the future, how it's going to be increasingly dynamic, how we'll see some jobs disappear, but we'll see a whole load of new jobs created, new sectors created as well. So there's new opportunity as well as new threat here. And one or two people have said to me already today, and often do when I do these kind of presentations, that this feels kind of a bit scary. I'm not meaning it to sound scary. I think what this represents a notion that there is radical, disruptive, significant change coming, and we need to be ready for it. We need to embrace it because it also represents opportunity as well. So if we look at that first item on the slide there, so 2/3 of primary school kids at the moment are going to end up working in jobs that don't exist right now. Now, that says two things to me. One, it says that there's an expectation there's going to be a lot of innovation that is going to create new jobs, new industries, new businesses, new sectors. But it also says that we need to look very hard at the way that we educate people to make sure that we do have the skills and capabilities needed for these new sectors. We're beginning to see what some of those new skills are. So we already see things around using big data, about creating and working with algorithms, about machine learning. But their new skills are also around how is it we articulate some of these new business propositions? How do we identify the value that we can give and deliver to our consumers and customers in new ways? How can we consider that we may be looking to engage with 6 generations at the same time of people, from baby boomers through to Gen Z? So this is all adding complexity, but it creates an opportunity as well for us to differentiate our businesses maybe. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is we're starting to see people say, actually, leadership is an increasingly critical issue to help us move through this transitional period from an analog to a digitized world. And my guess is that that idea of leadership and trying to adopt new ways of working, new notions around leadership, is one of the reasons you're in the room today. And I think this goes to the heart of the leadership challenge. So we've spoken a couple of times about increasing complexity, increasing uncertainty. I think this is where we're used to working, really. We're used to working down there when we're fairly clear about what the future might hold. We're fairly clear about the agreement that we have with people that are working around us about what the solution is. But actually, if we look at the notion around exponential change, if we look at the degree of uncertainty, if we look at those a dozen or so drivers from the beginning, and we think about how they interact together to create uncertainty and complexity, then maybe we're in the realms of wicked problems. Maybe we're in the realm of not normal leadership, but extraordinary leadership. And maybe we need to explore and examine what that actually means. Because I don't think it's what we have now, which is the kind of the right sort of skills, but maybe not all in the right person, or not in the same person, maybe scattered around the organization. Maybe our structures of our organizations don't actually allow us to be effective leaders. I think it's more behavioral driven rather than structural. but those are some of the questions maybe we should ask. So I think that's where we are. We're far from agreeing. I've not presented anything today that I would put my hand on my heart and say this is going to happen. But I would say we need to be aware that it could happen, and therefore I think we should be thinking about resilient and flexible strategies in case it does. And I think that's a different mindset within our organisations. So here's our leadership challenge, I think. I have no idea what that little box is. Oh, it's gone now. So our challenge, I think, is to build mindsets and skills for the co-creation of new offerings with colleagues, partners, and customers. And I think we've often spoken in most organisations, I think, about how we partner with people, how we partner with customers and consumers outside the organisation. In my experience, we tend to develop partnership strategy to face out from the organisation and kind of forget about the capability inside the organisation of what that means for us. What does it change in the culture of the organisation? What does it mean for the way that we partner inside so that when the customers interact with our organisation, they get a sense that their organisation really believes in partnership and collaboration rather than it just being part of the sales pitch. And I think this is not an exhaustive list, but it's the kind of skills that I think are going to be critically important for leadership as we go forward. So how do we learn much quicker than we've learned before? How do we gather the appropriate experiences? How do we work more collaboratively? What do we mean by partnership compared to collaborative working? Because there's a set of behaviours around those things that I think are really different. And if we want to be authentic and create real value and trust with our customers and consumers, I think we need to act in the way that we're describing the way that we're intending to act. I think increasingly, if automation is going to become a much bigger thing within our businesses, we need to be able to exhibit empathy with the employees that we do have in the organisation, particularly if we're going to transition to a more automated business. I think things around scenario thinking, foresight, sense making, this tolerance of uncertainty that I've mentioned about a few times are going to be critically important. And I think foresight is one of those skills that people kind of have heard about, but they don't really understand what it means. And some people think it's really about taking a bit of a pot shot about what might happen in the future. And it's not. It's actually about trying to make sense of the signals that we're seeing that point to the future, thinking about a range of plausible outcomes that they may deliver, but making sure they move back to where we are now so they're connected with the present. Because if we create if we create futures that aren't plausible, then it's really difficult to get people to engage with them within our organisations. So a range of new leadership skills, I think, and a challenge for us as leaders within the business to kind of create this more co-creative workplace. You'll get the hang of this by the time it's time to go, won't I? So, okay, so those are the three things that I'd like to think about in this session. And in the first session, what we did, we focused very much on what was happening out there in the outside world. So what are the things that we're seeing out there in terms of the operating environment? Here, I think this is about what we can do about it, and particularly what we can do about us and the people that work with us, and maybe the proposition that we take to our customers and consumers. So what are the challenges or opportunities, the future factors, what do they set up for you? How do the future factors impact how you deliver value to your customers and consumers? And what are your observations about the capabilities and resources you need to acquire to be successful in the future? So if you can do the same kind of thing, have a think for a couple of minutes individually about those questions, and then for 15 minutes, have a conversation on your tables about what these things mean to you. I think some of the ideas of organisations and businesses creating a much greater sense of sustainability, ecosystem responsibility, social responsibility are kind of really interesting, and I suspect at some point in the future that may well be a place that we get to, but I guess that relies on probably a little bit more of a carrot and stick approach. So all the time we can invest in certain ways to reduce the amount of tax that we pay, which of course can feed into a large number of social programs. You know, maybe that we'll think about how it is that we might do that. And I just wonder if in my bag over there I had an AI application that would allow you all to double your profits and halve the number of people you employ. how tempting that proposition might be. And I think therein maybe lies one of the issues about how it is that we access what we're framing as a very human future, because there is no doubt a degree of responsibility that maybe as businesses that we should take. But at what point do we decide that we choose to do that without any of the other approaches from government around how we change taxation, maybe how automations should be taxed, maybe the other ways that we need to raise money in order to fund universal basic income or universal basic services, if it turns out that we need them, and if that period of need is short or is it long, because there's a whole bunch of other technologies coming along that could create new businesses and new business sectors. And I think that plays into this kind of notion that what we're seeing at the moment is such uncertainty and such complexity that people sometimes don't see the opportunity that's represented beyond that. Because actually what we need to do is really focus on what we're doing over the near term in order to continue to be successful so we're still here next year. So I think there are some interesting kind of challenges and opportunities wrapped up in that. Does anyone want to add anything to the conversation? Does anyone want that AI thing I've got in my bag? I thought so. If you want, I mean, I'm quite happy to share some observations and things that I've jotted down. That'd be all right. Gillian, yeah? It's really hard, isn't it, to really take a step away from what we're doing on a day-to-day basis and think really differently, be that about the future or be that about how we might interact with someone because there might be some possible benefit for us a bit further down the track. Because what we know and what's kind of almost programmed into us is what we need to do in order to be successful going forward. But I think what was really interesting was that the common themes that particularly struck me in the first part were very much around learning, very much around development and how we engage. So how does technology make us better as people? I can't remember who said that, but I thought that was a really, really interesting point. And that's probably at the heart that the opportunity that this growth in technology represents. How do we really harness the power of technology to make us better people and to make society better rather than to enrich shareholders of big technology companies? I think there was a lot said as well about how we actually enhance our capability, and I think it wasn't spoken about too much very specifically, but a lot of that is behavioural. So there's this thing that's going on at the moment, I think, where maybe a lot of the skill stuff that we do, certainly the routine skilled stuff, can be taken away from us through automation. But actually what that then leaves us with is the kind of the human piece. So what are the changing behaviours that we might need to see? And maybe it's the behavioural piece that becomes a big part of learning and development we do in the future. So some of those may be softer skills. So what is it that we mean by empathy? How do we exhibit empathy? What's the value of empathy within our organisations and with the people that we work with? What do we mean by sense making? How do we take on foresight? How do we actually get used to operating in a world that's increasingly complex, increasingly uncertain? Because, you know, as I said earlier on, that's the reality of where we are. So I think that was really interesting when we started to broaden some of the notion of what we mean by capabilities. I think the other thing, and I suppose it was linked to that really, was the comment about peer-to-peer learning. So how is it we can operate collaboratively with people within our network, within our ecosystem, maybe in different sectors as well, just to learn from them? Are there complementary skills that we have that we can share and help each other to develop businesses in a collaborative way? And I think this last session, it's really hard, isn't it, to separate what's going on outside from what it actually means for us inside. And we kind of had that merging, I think, in both sessions. So we were talking this last session about, you know, what's our plan B? This technology is all really good, but what if it stops working? What do we do then? You know, it's a bit like when the internet doesn't work. because the internet service provider has got some kind of problem. You look at the computer and you look around a bit, and there is pen and paper around, but you don't know what it's for. And so there's this. What do we do? What's our plan B? And maybe that's a cultural thing in the organisation as well. Maybe we need to get used to taking a step back from the technology so we continue to remember that actually we're humans as well. I think the comment about business development in a learning environment is really interesting. So, what are the new skills that we need to do? What's changing about our environment that makes us do something we've not done before? So we actually have to acquire those new skills to start with. We have to acquire that new capability. Maybe we have to look at the resources that we have and reallocate them to other parts of the business. But I think this kind of constant changing of our business, the skills, the capabilities, maybe the products and services, maybe the value that we deliver to our customers and clients, I suspect that's going to become the norm in the future. And I think one of the areas where we've seen that that's starting to come true is in the retail sector. So if we look at the number of big retailers that have gone to the wall more recently, they've not been able to keep pace with the changing nature of what their consumers and customers want. So I think there's a big lesson there. And obviously Kodak and Blockbuster were indicators of that as well. We kind of touched on it a little bit in that last conversation as well about this kind of balance between what's our responsibility as businesses and employers to our ecosystem. Because we know that government is, first of all, very busy doing something else. And we also know that government quite often wants to jump on a gravy train because there's a really good idea over here. Does that mean that we wait for the regulations to change and for government to create new policy? Or do we genuinely believe that we do have a business responsibility to operate in our societies in a way that creates different value beyond just a good positive PR message? So do we genuinely believe that the 17 UN sustainability goals represent a good strategic framework for us to be not only a successful but a socially responsible business as well? And that kind of touches, I think, the last point here I've written down, which is, what is our motivation anyway? Because our motivation has to be to make money, because actually if we don't make money, then we can't do all this other good socially responsible stuff as well. So how do we bring those two together within our businesses? And importantly, how do we create a culture inside the business that helps people realize the reason we're doing this is not only for the good of the business, but it's for the good of ourselves as human beings within the business. And I think a lot of the things that we've spoken about there really come to the heart of what I believe and what my business partner believes about creating a very human future, about using where we are now, both in our development as humans, as well as the opportunity that technology represents, to find ways where technology supports humanity and we don't go down the kind of the dystopian route, which is where technology rules us. Because I think we are very close to seeing that come to fruition. And I guess maybe in a society like in the UK, it's business that maybe has to start that debate. So I kind of apologise if that sounded a little bit preachy, but it kind of helps, I think, explain where we're coming from. So I think this is kind of wraps up what I was saying there. It's nice when the plan comes together. So I think we do need to be the change that we want to see in the world. And in a kind of, I'm sensing around the room that a lot of people understand that and want to achieve this idea that we're socially responsible in our businesses as well as make money. And the kind of the compulsory ad at the end. If there's anything that I've said that interests you, then go to our website. You can subscribe to our newsletter. That's free. Just use that code. And there's a 10% discount off the books, as well as a copy of this book available for you to take today. And with that, I'm very happy to take any other questions that you might have. Thank you for your attention.